I told them in the back that the news this year is it's not going to be as good as last year. Thank you very much. We'll see you later. That's really kind of the truth, but we're going to talk about a few more real specifics. Key issues, fundamental shifts in grain and oilseed supply situation. We've got a very different world now than we had 3 years ago. That's to our benefit. We're going to take advantage of that. We already are taking advantage of that. We'll talk about some specifics here in a bit. World and domestic economic growth. Things aren't peachy, but they're certainly better than they were, and they kind of are improving everywhere, including even the EU, which is still pretty questionable. And we'll talk a lot about the situation here in the United States as far as consumer attitudes, and especially consumer preferences for meat. We've seen a major shift in the last couple of years in meat demand. Whether that continues is a big question of the performance of this market going forward. Expansion everywhere. Chicken, belated but big. We thought they would get after it last year. They had all kinds of trouble doing that, but they're rolling now, and they're going to increase production this year pretty substantially going forward. Hogs, overcoming PEDV. I think it's been remarkable how little the losses have been this year on PEDV. It looks like you producers have done a marvelous job of trying to manage this disease. Now that's the good news. The good news is not as many pigs are dying. The bad news is they're all going to show up at packing plants at some point, and so there's going to be some negative price impacts. Cattle, a long time coming, and a long time till we get the expansion of beef output. So that's going to help us in the market for a while. We look at the grain situation, a fundamental difference, steadily growing world production and consumption on corn, but notice what's happened to stocks. Stocks have grown steadily since 2003. We've kind of overcome the ethanol shock here, and we're back to the carryout levels worldwide that we were back in the early 2000s. So some real significant market impacts. Corn production in the rest of the world has grown dramatically. It's up about 50% since 2004, meaning that and a lot of that's in the southern hemisphere, meaning that we have kind of a counterbalancing supply there that we've had like in the bean market for some time. On the soybean side, again, record production, record consumption, but again here, stocks are record high, actually, in soybeans. I'm pretty bearish about soybeans long term, and if we've seen some of the reports coming out of South America, we're coming off 2 record crops. You had a record crop in Brazil last year. You got a forecast this week from Solaris of 92.4 million metric tons down there, up 3% from their last forecast, and that compares to 87 and change, I think, last year. So a big soybean crop coming from there. So I think soybeans are going to be under some pressure. The difference, of course, is China, which seems to take whatever beans you have, and this export pace has run ahead of what we thought it would be so far this year. It's probably going to be shifting towards South America here in the short run. But we think that soybeans are going to be under some pressure long term. If we look at January WASDE, USDA reduced the crop size on corn slightly, reduced carryout slightly. All of that should have been bullish, and of course the market just kind of yawned at it for the next week and really didn't do anything. If we look at on the bean side, that one was bearish because the projected stocks were left alone when analysts thought they were going to reduce them, and we saw a sharp downturn in beans early on. We still got beans down. Soybean was down there. The bull was really kind of a veal calf. It just didn't do anything out of this report. But still, this says that we have plenty of product available. Almost 2 billion bushels of corn, almost over 410 million bushels of beans. If we look at the entire balance sheet, a few usage changes. USDA reduced feed usage, feed and residual, by 100 million bushels. But still, that number is 4.7% larger than a year ago. That fits reasonably well with what we think livestock usage is going to be, and livestock numbers are going to fit this year. On the ethanol side, they increased it slightly, mainly because of lower gasoline prices. We're going to use some more gasoline. Now, that doesn't mean that the demand for ethanol is going to be terribly strong, because pricing is probably going to be soft because of those lower gasoline prices. Non-ethanol usage they left alone, as they did for exports. 1.877 is a 13.8% carryout. Now, if we look at price versus carryout, their forecast for next year is right along the same kind of relationship we've had over the last 5 or 6 years. So they're basically a steady corn demand. I think there's a question in the corn market. It's whether that demand line really will hold steady with lower ethanol prices. It could put some downward pressure on prices, but still, this 350 to 450 range. We're going to see a lot of corn in that range over the next decade, except for short crop years. This year, this is the average annual weighted farm price, which is farm monthly prices weighted by monthly farm sales of corn. So it gets loaded early in the year to some degree in most cases. We think it could drift down a little bit toward the mid-3s here as we go through the year. On the usage side, of course, ethanol pretty flat. We have the ethanol plants have been running full the last year or so. There's no plants being built. I don't think we're going to see any increase to speak of. We're very close to the total renewable fuel standard that was set in the 2007 law. We look at increase in feed and residual, very close to where we were a year ago. And if you add up feed and residual plus the DDGS, we're back close to this record availability of corn-based feed ingredients. So there's kind of the message in a nutshell on feed prices going forward. Ethanol margins, we expect them to get lower as we go through the year just because of gasoline prices. But they've come off a great year last year when they were operating full. On the soybean side, the big change here, of course, is almost, we had practically no beans at the end of last marketing year. 410 million bushels forecast for this year. But the thing that I think has surprised the market is how long it's taken to refill the pipeline out of this deal. It was so empty, and that caused a lot of kind of pent-up demand of sorts for bean meal, we think, in the fourth quarter that pushed this bean meal price a little higher than what we had expected it to go. We still think bean meal is going to drop back down in the low 3s here as we go through the year. So, implications of current and future costs. Lower costs will fuel expansion across the board. I mean, everyone's going to benefit from these. The timing obviously differs. Fundamental and long-term change in grain prices. We've caught up with ethanol usage. The growing output of oil and gas output will limit ethanol future growth. And finally, yields continue to grow. The only real cost hikes that we see on this situation is now weather-related. It's not a demand situation anymore. We've kind of adjusted to that. So our thought right now is a lot of corn from 350 to 450, maybe on the low side of that just a bit, and a lot of bean meal between $300 and $400 a ton over the next decade. I wouldn't be surprised by that at all. We think that's where it's going to be. And if you take those kinds of numbers, you're going to have costs that are kind of comparable to where we are here, somewhere in the low 70s on a carcass weight basis in our model. This model runs $5 to $6 a hundredweight higher than some of the real good commercial producers out there. We had $94 2 years ago, $80 last year, and of course about $70 now. And so I think we're going to see a lot of these cost figures right around $70, $75 over the next several years. I'd keep that in mind. On the cattle side, if you look at cost of these cattle coming out, these numbers aren't translated into lower costs here because cattlemen are terribly irrational about buying feeder cattle. If we took cost of gain, the cost of gains are down 20%. But the price of those feeder cattle going in have set these break-evens so high, I'm not sure how anybody ever had a chance of making money on this deal. Now, this model is a full-cost, commercial, custom feeding model, markups on feed, yardage fees, all of those kind of things. That many cattle feeders don't have those costs. But still, there are a lot of break-evens in the 160 to 170 range here as we go through this year, and it's going to be really hard to make any money on those. Okay, economy. The world economy has improved some over the last year or so. This is from Moody's Analytics. It was actually done in October. They got a lot of things right. They got one badly wrong, and that's Japan. They had Japan in recovery in October. I'm not sure why they did then because they'd already been in one quarter of a recession, and now they had another one, which makes it an official recession. So Japan is officially back into recession. There's some question in China, but of course the question in China is whether it's going to grow 9% or 7%. I mean, now you say, well, we kind of scoff at that a bit, that's real risk, but a 2% change on economic growth in an economy that big is important. 1.3 billion times any number is a great big number, and so that kind of translates through here, and we got to keep that in mind. The problem is still the EU. Still a lot of difficulty there, very high unemployment rates, very sluggish growth. And so, North America is doing quite better. If we look by region, here's the world forecast by Moody's, a little over 3% growth this year and next. North America, a little better than that. Of course, Europe's still the drag, but it's improving. Asia, in spite of those problems in China, still growing at over 4% per year for the next couple of years. So, a generally optimistic outlook for world economic growth. On the U.S. side, the economy has picked up steam, and we've had 2 quarters here of 4.5% and 5% quarter-to-quarter growth in GDP. Now, the bars here are annual, year-over-year growth, and they're not nearly as good, but this is an economy that is kind of picking up some steam. And I think, we hear a little bit of talk out of the Fed about starting to toy with some interest rates. I think the real leverage point of this deal will be the inflation rate. And if they see much inflation kicking up in this economy, they'll move pretty quickly to raise interest rates a bit to try to cool that off. I've never worked at the Federal Reserve, but everything I know about them is if they could get 3% growth and keep inflation at 2%, that would be nirvana for a central banker, okay? And I'd have to argue that that's a pretty good thing, too. You get into these kinds of things where you're trying to get rich quick and things don't work very good. Getting rich slowly is a very good plan. And I think that might be the case here. Translating that into what it means for consumers has been a little more difficult because last year, real personal disposable income per capita, which is after taxes, was 0 growth, okay, versus the year before. Now, we've had some wild spikes here that had to do with Social Security tax rates back in late 2012, early 2013. But then this year, we've been pretty good. 1.4, 1.5, 1.6%. November was 2.2%. So you've got real personal incomes growing at a reasonably good pace now. Not quite the average of where we were before the recession, but again, it's encouraging to me, especially that we've had pretty stable growth and then we've had this increase toward the end of the year. One of the things, the outgrowths of that is that consumer confidence continues to grow. The 2 measures that we have of consumer confidence, one done by the University of Michigan, this Consumer Sentiment Index, the other one the Consumer Confidence Index from the Conference Board, have been steadily growing since 2009. They actually hit the highest levels they've been since 2006 in December. If you look at what that means, I've always thought it was interesting how clearly the negative relationship of unemployment with consumer confidence is. And really, consumer confidence comes first, and unemployment changes after that. It kind of leads it by a few months. So as this continues to grow, we would expect the unemployment rate to fall some. Now, how much? Okay, we're down at 5.2%, I believe, is the number, something like that. There's what's we economists call the natural rate of unemployment. There's some amount of unemployment always in the economy. People changing jobs, people decide they just don't, they're not going to work for a while. It's kind of natural. The question is, where is it? Because when you go below it, you start putting very strong inflationary pressure on the economy because you drive up wage rates. And so we've seen that happen. And look what happens when it got down here. Well, we had the kind of the recession of 2001 and 2. It got down to 5% again here. And of course, this one wasn't really caused by inflation pressure, obviously. It was a banking situation, a crisis, a financial crisis. But still, if we start pushing unemployment back down to the low 5 range, down to the low 4 range, I think we're going to see some problems again. So I really hope that we don't do that and we don't push the economy fast enough to outgrow the labor supply in that fashion. Retail, if we look at restaurants, over 20 months of growth here of over 100 index by the Restaurant Performance Index. So this sector is doing much better. In fact, the November observation was the highest since way back, I think, in 2005. So on kind of every measure here, the economy seems to be doing good. The outlets for our products seem to be doing good. And now we have cheap oil and cheap gasoline to throw on top of it. I grew up in Oklahoma, so it kind of gives me the shivers to talk about $40 oil being cheap when I remember it being $6. But still, it's way cheap compared to 80 and 100, where it was just in recent history. And of course, gasoline below $2 a gallon at retail in virtually every state in the United States now. What does that mean? I tell the story. I drive a beautiful 2000 Chevy pickup that is bright yellow except for where it's rust. And when I got it, my daughter commented that, boy, that pickup really gets good gas mileage. And I said, no, my dear, that pickup has a 35-gallon tank in it. And so she learned something there. And last fall, when I would go to the Casey's in Adel and fill that thing up, the pump would get to $100 before it got full. And I filled it up 2 weeks ago for $65. All right. So my daughter gladly spent the $35 I still had in my pocket, and national income was improved. So that's the thing that's going on here. I've been really kind of surprised by the discussion around lower oil prices the last couple of months. You'd think that the world was going to hell in a handbasket because the price of oil was going down. And if it was caused by a worldwide recession, I would say that that's right. But I don't see the evidence of that out there. And the U.S. economy, somewhere around 5% of the workforce is involved in energy production, and 95% of the workforce is involved in energy consumption. So who do you think is going to win on this deal? Okay, I see this as being a tremendously stimulative thing for the economy, that people will have far more dollars in their pocket to spend on whatever they might choose, discretionary income. And so I've been surprised it hasn't played out more that way in the press. But this is a price war. It's a price war between the Saudis and the rest of the world, and they're going to see just how cheap people can produce oil. Now, when the gas stations in your town used to have a price war, for all you youngsters in here, you ask us gray hairs, and we'll tell you about these. They used to happen. Okay? Who won in those things? Consumers won. Consumers win in a price war. And we're in one in oil. So I think consumers are going to win, and I think it's going to be stimulative to other parts of the economy. Now, for us, the negative side, there's always a flip side with an economist, is when oil prices go down, guess what the dollar does? It goes up. These are the two great collections of wealth in the world, oil and dollars. Okay? And so when one goes down, the other goes up. And you can see, there's a very clear negative correlation to this thing. It's pretty regular. And we knew it was going to happen. And that's, neither here nor there, except for if you're an exporter, this is not good news. So it's not great news for grains. It's not great news for hogs. It's not great news for cattle. It's not great news for the poultry industry, because our products are getting more expensive because of, and it's correlated with the drop in oil prices. So on the one hand, we're going to gain. On the other hand, we're going to lose. How that comes out in the balance will determine much of what happens this year. Consumer demand, though, the last couple of years, I think the big driver has been a market change in preferences. Demand is determined by the price of competitive goods, the price of complementary goods, income levels, and consumer tastes and preferences. And that's the black box. And that's the one that for 30 years has really worked against us. Fat's bad. Meat's bad. We've heard lots of these stories. This is the cover of Time last July, and the title is Eat Butter. I've been living for this, okay? All right? I never thought I'd see it on Time magazine, though. And the whole article is about how we got it wrong in the 70s and 80s on animal fats. And it traces it all the way back to when this all started. It really started when Dwight Eisenhower had a heart attack when he was president, when he was a sitting president. And news all over the world. The president had a heart attack, and one or two guys said, well, that stuff in those arteries is made out of cholesterol, so eating cholesterol must be bad. Off they ran. And a pretty good article about the history of it, and the fact that new evidence has shown us that it's not necessarily that bad. We've seen The Big Fat Surprise by Nina Tycho's become a bestseller. A couple of weeks ago, I ran across this one on Vox.com. It's a news service, an online news service. Greg Ferenstein did a thing where he went on a diet of about 3 weeks, and all he ate was bacon and cream. Okay? I thought, that is my kind of diet, I'll tell you. He lost 12 pounds, and his cholesterol went down 10 points. Okay? And doctors were telling him he was going to kill himself. So, it's an interesting thing that's going on in that this is kind of all built up. Now, how does it manifest itself? Well, it manifests itself in the demand side, in the willingness to pay. People have been unbelievably willing to pay high prices for meat proteins. Now, no question that tighter supplies have caused part of this. But those increases in beef and pork prices are much larger than would have been suggested by reduced supplies. And when we put them together in a real per capita expenditures measure, which mimics the demand indexes that Professor Grimes has done for many years, we can see all four species up every month of the year, growing toward the end of the year. The only month that wasn't was January, And I think that was a weather deal. We had terrible weather on the East Coast last year. Last year was higher than the year before virtually every month. We look at pork, up 8.9% in November, 7.6% total for the year. And you can see that last year's numbers were up 5.5%. So add those together, 13% increase in real per capita expenditures in just 2 years. All right. Here's beef. Terrific growth in beef per capita expenditures this last quarter, and up 7% or so. This is measured by choice beef prices. This is measured by all fresh beef prices. And then we look at chicken, not so much. This is a red meat phenomenon pretty much. I mean, it's really benefited red meat better. Now, I don't have turkey up here because I really don't have a very good retail price of turkey. USDA only publishes a whole bird price. If we took the parts prices of turkey at the wholesale level, it appears that demand there may have been better than any of these other species last year. They were tremendous at the wholesale level last year. So here's pork and beef over time, real per capita expenditures. You can see the upturn. This is the highest observation since 1990 for pork. The highest observation for beef in November since 2005. This was the Atkins diet, okay? And the good thing is that this one surge isn't named after somebody that might die of a heart attack, okay? So this is a real change, and whether it lasts, I don't know that we can predict that very well, but it certainly looks like it has legs at this point. What does it mean for consumption? Now, lots of people say, well, boy, pork consumption is down this year, so demand is bad. Not necessarily. Demand is quantity and price. So you've just seen the price side of it, but what does it mean long term? It means costs are down, demand is up. We should be able to gain back some of this this per capita consumption that we've lost here as costs went up. And I would think this is going up. This is the forecast from the Livestock Marketing Information Center for 2015 and 2016. At the rate at which we're growing right now, we might be able to beat that a bit, and a lot of it depends on how much we export. And, of course, that's not been a very pretty picture this year. Exports down 1.7% for the year. A couple of things going on. Notice that this real downturn on exports coincides pretty closely to that upturn on the dollar a while ago. We've had trouble with Russia. We know that. One of the big problems with Russia is that when it backed out of the pork markets, when it put sanctions on, and even before that when it backed out of the EU market because of African swine fever, it left 40,000 tons a month available to the market that had to go somewhere. And a lot of that has found its way to our customers in Japan and China, and that has certainly hurt our exports for this year. If we look at beef exports, notice the patterns here. Grow through 2012, pretty much flat. Okay? Look at beef. Grow through 2012 or 11, flat. If I had chicken up here, it'd look almost exactly the same. So this tells me that the low-hanging fruit of export growth has probably been picked. We're not going to have the kind of growth we've had in the past. Doesn't mean it's going to fall off the face of the earth, but we certainly can't count on growth there taking a lot of extra product off of the U.S. market every year. We grow production by 4 or 5%. Most of that's going to have to find its way to a U.S. consumer. That's important because it's going to make a lot to do with prices. Going back to the dollar, here's that chart you saw a while ago, and here's the dollar versus individual currencies. This is the real. So Brazil has gained tremendous pricing power relative to us. Here's the euro. It's certainly lost value recently. And, of course, Canada and Australia's dollar have both lost value the last 3 years. I put Australia in here because it's so important on the beef side. If we look at customers, all of them have lost value except for the Chinese renminbi, which is pegged to the dollar. Now, I had a question last week. Just how important was this deal by Switzerland last week? Switzerland had been pegging the franc to the euro. And as an economist, when I hear the word pegging, I think that is a future problem waiting to happen. Okay? Because what that does is it puts a restriction. It's kind of like those tectonic plates in an earthquake. You know, they're pushing against it and they're building all this pressure, and then what happens when it lets go? All hell breaks loose, right? And that's kind of what this does. If you peg a currency, it wants to go somewhere and you're not letting it. So they're having to do things like buy securities or whatever they're doing to make that currency stay there. And then if it ever lets loose, It went 60%. It went up 60% immediately. It settled back about 30. And the thing about this is a lot of assets were valued in Swiss francs. And so it really changes asset valuations. Well, that Switzerland deal is child's play compared to the Chinese currency. Because think of the size of the economies. I don't think China's ever going to let it float. I mean, short of a war. Okay? And they are letting it gain value some over time. But it's one of the major things. I think it's really causing imbalances. This is one of the reasons we have such an imbalance of payments with China is because of what they do with their currency. And again, if they ever were to let it float, it would be a huge adjustment in world economies. Matter of fact, it'd be so huge that they're going to have to do it on a very gradual basis, kind of like they're doing. I wish they'd do it a little faster than they are, because I think it'd be a much more valuable currency. Okay, let's talk real quick about chicken. I'm not going to mention it here. Growth, growth, growth. We thought they would grow 4% last year. They didn't get it done. They had all kinds of production problems. They got started in November. We had some 10% year-over-year growth rate weeks in December. We've been up a steady 4 to 5%, mainly due to weights. But those weights mean that the big boning bird sector of that business is growing, and that's the part of the business that was going to grow. Okay, so they're moving to rapid growth rates. We look for that 3 to 4% to happen this year, maybe toward the top of it. Lower chicken prices, still going to be profitable. If you've seen any of the kind of forward-looking statements out of the chicken companies, they're pretty optimistic for this year, and rightfully so. Their costs are down dramatically, and so they can handle lower chicken prices. Chicken's going to be very competitive. Last year it was a positive for pork demand. It's going to be a drag on pork demand as we go through 2015. On the cattle side, it's all about weather. Of course, this is the drought of 2011. This is the drought of 2012. Severe impacts on the nation's cow herd. Here's where we are as of this week. Much better conditions, and we've seen a lot of heifer retention. Heifer slaughter was down about 8% last year. The cattle inventory report comes out next Friday. We think that heifer's health for replacement is going to be up sharply because of this. I mean, profit potentials on cow-calf operation have been out the ceiling, and so we've seen very high replacement animal values, but the long-term trend has been down. And the industry is trying to reverse numbers of cattle, trying to reverse numbers of beef cows down about 20 to about 28 million. Calf crop is the lowest calf crop, I think, since the 40s. This year's calf crop might go up a bit, but not very much. It'll take next year to see a significant improvement on that. Very tight feeder cattle supplies. I mentioned a while ago, cattle feeders' propensity to pay too much for feeder cattle. There weren't very many of them out there this year. That was one of the reasons they did it. But beef consumption lower yet again in 15 and again in 16 before it probably turns around in 17, and we will see higher per capita beef offerings here in the United States by then. So for the next 2 years, we're still going to have very expensive beef. That's going to be continue to be a positive for pork demand. A little bit on cattle on feed. The numbers on this come out tomorrow. But one of the things that's happened here is we placed fewer cattle than we did a year ago for almost all of the year, and yet we ended up with December 1 inventories higher. And the reason was we're not shipping the darn things. I mean, and they're getting really big, and which is a normal kind of reaction here. But these marketings have kind of got to come to town at some point, and we think they're going to do that here in the fourth quarter. So cattle summary, growth means tighter near-term supplies, higher prices through 15 and 16. We don't see any break really until 17. The recent sell-off, we think, especially on the futures, is caused by mainly some long positions liquidating out of there on some technicals. You see a huge basis right now with fat cattle out in the countryside, but you don't have a contract until February. David, I don't know. They started taking deliveries against the February contract. When does that start? Start this week? I don't know that. I don't know the answer to that. But you don't have a delivery mechanism early on that's very effective on this. Something's going to have to give on that basis at some point. And I'm always one that thinks that the cash market normally reflects current supply and demand, and the future is probably going to have to come to that. So if that's the case, they've sold off too far. Long-term impacts, very high prices on beef consumers. I mean, they've got 2 more years of $4 ground beef and $8, $9, $10 steaks. This is some opportunity to change some habits. I wrote about that opportunity last year, and PDV wiped it out for us. But it doesn't look like that's going to be the case this year. We're going to be very competitively priced. Can we change habits in this time of price differences? That's a major goal. I know that the folks at the Pork Board are talking about it. They look at this as a strike while the iron's hot deal. We need to change habits while we have an opportunity. Okay, let's talk about pig supplies. This is PEDV case accessions. Here's where we were on January 3rd. I guess January 10th. I think I've got 3rd on here somewhere, but I did pick up one more day. 51 new cases, case accessions, compared to 118 or something like that last year. I mean, this was the peak, I guess. This year, the peak was 118 versus 187. It peaked out at 315 back in February last year. It would have to get really bad, really fast to even get close to that this year. Obviously, it's a much, much better situation. And a good number of these case accessions are coming out of monitoring. Monitoring farms that had already had it, and now it has another case accession that pops up positive. Not unusual. I think the more important piece of information we've been getting in the last several months is this Minnesota survey of 19 large systems that have 2.1 million sows. I always point out, and the Minnesota folks will point this out, it's not a scientific sample, but it is a big one. Okay, 2.1 million, 40% of the sows in the United States. And look at the number of sow farms that have broke with PEDV this year versus a year ago. During November, December, it's 12 this year versus 85. And so, and even in the ones that have broke, we're understanding that, you know, they're not having as high death loss in many cases. We still have some naive sows out there, so if we get that in those sow herds, we expect a high pre-weaning death loss. But it has not been nearly as bad this year as last, and not even nearly as bad as most people expected it to be. Part of that's weather, part of it's biosecurity, part of it's vaccines. I mean, there's a lot of factors here, but they've all added up to a pretty effective job of controlling these. So there's the numbers. You know, I've shown this quite a bit. We started trying to estimate last spring what the impacts on slaughter were going to be. We were pretty close during the summer. May, June, July, August, you can see our forecast awfully close to the actual numbers. It started falling apart in September, and our forecast was too large on the declines. And then, you know, we're back here. We're going to be down 3% plus for December numbers. Part of that, and we think a larger part of it, is attributable to lower PRRS losses. I mean, PRRS losses cases were lots lower. This comes from the same University of Minnesota publication than it was the year before. Here's where we are now, and we're hearing some talk just in the last couple of weeks of a new strain of PRRS that's been pretty hot in some areas. But again, we're starting from a pretty low baseline here. I don't know where that's going to take us, but it may not take us much beyond where we were last year. We'll have to see. But still, the animal health, the health survivability situation is much better, and USDA finally picked that up. Their March and June reports weren't very good. I mean, we suspected that before they came out. We made some kind of major adjustments to our forecast relative to the USDA reports because we thought they'd missed it. Historically, and I always point back, 10, 15 years ago when there actually used to be changes in the pork industry, the Hogs and Pigs report, we always said, well, they catch the turn a quarter late. It was 2 quarters this time. But they finally caught up in September. The September report looked pretty good. And so we're putting most of our stock in the December report. We think it was pretty close. It came out a little bullish. All of the numbers generally are bigger than what was expected, but not very because hardly any of them are over 1% difference. And so pretty much as expected report. But it did point to rapid expansion, 3.7% on the breeding herd, a pig crop that was up 4%, and lightweight inventories commensurate to that. Okay, and probably more important, farrowing intentions up 3 to 4% for the next 2 quarters. The last piece on here that says that we're having more pigs, of course, is the litter size was 10.23, actually larger than a year ago. Now, the real litter size damage came in the next 2 quarters. You can see that here, okay, not that one last year. But that 10.23 is the 3rd highest on record, okay? That's pretty good. And we're probably back on a growth pattern here. If we look at farrowings as a percentage of the farrowing rate for the December 1 breeding herd in the next 2 quarters, there's the numbers in the report. Those are pretty normal. If anything, they might be a little bit low. Okay, so we might get a few more litters. If we look at litter sizes, the normal pattern from September, November to the next 2 quarters is marked by the red there. And if we did that compared to a year ago, those litters would be almost 7 and almost 5% larger. So do the math. make sure you're sitting down. 3% more litters, 7% bigger litters. How many pigs is that? Now, you don't need to take shoes off to count that one. It's 10, okay? 3% more litters, 5% more pigs, 8%. So that's the potential that's in here. Now, do we think that's going to happen? Well, the farrowing growth is very likely. There was some overstocking with females to handle PEDV, and it's left most units very full, so I think that's going to probably happen. Question is breeding and farrowing efficiency. Some of these operations have been through PEDV, have seen lags in farrowing efficiency for some time period behind. So that'll be a bit of a drag, but we still think those are pretty doable. Litter size, we said it was unlikely when the report came out. That's before we've seen the last several weeks of PEDV data. And so our forecast, we've got about 2/3 the size of growth on litters is what that normal pattern would suggest. I'm here to tell you today, I'm thinking we're creeping back more toward the normal pattern. We may be a little low on this. So that's the numbers that are in our forecast that you'll see here in a little bit. And here's where our weekly slaughters would be based on those numbers. Green is this year, or 14, pardon me. Blue is 13. Red is 15. Okay? And you can see some sizable gains the second half of the year. We've been very close to those red observations so far. So I think the report is proving to be pretty accurate. The real one big question is going to be weights. Of course, we grew them rapidly last spring. I think that's going to come to a halt here probably in March. We expect weights to be higher than a year ago for a couple of months, and then to start running maybe 1 to 2% lower, simply because we're going to have the buildings full again. And we just won't be able to feed pigs as long. The feed cost situation is better, but we expect those weights to be down as we go through the summer, and we're taking 1% off of the slaughter numbers for the year for weights as we compute our production. Pork production last year, remarkably, because of this weight increase, 1.4% lower than the year before. So we had all of that price impact on a very small reduction in output at the end of the day. And then we had this wild roller coaster of prices, which is a classic information-starved market in my mind. I mean, we just didn't know what was coming. Some people started buying, everybody started buying. Some people started selling, everybody started selling. It was just a wild ride. You can see that that's very abnormal. But notice what's happened in the fourth quarter. As we've kind of gotten more used to the information, we got more comfortable with what's there. We had a lot of stability in the fourth quarter. Now we've been low as we've gone through this first several weeks. And I can only attribute that to a couple of things. One is we've had a lot of pressure on the futures market, and part of that is because of the unwinding of these long positions that were in the cattle business. And that spills over to hogs every time it happens. And so part of that is that. The other one is, and the one that's kind of gotten the press recently, and it's been cooking for a while, is this situation on the ports on the West Coast. That really started back in late November, I guess. It wasn't a big deal at the time. It kind of got hung on. And the duration of these gets important because when you have that slowdown, you're slowing the flow of product, both in and out. And now we've heard stories in the last week or two of canceled shipments of pork heading to the coast. Now, when that happens, then that pork's got to go somewhere. And we've seen some real pressure on wholesale prices. Packers have taken that out of the hog market, very normal kind of thing. I think if we can turn that around, we'll get better. But the other point is I think we've been trying to move some hogs out of barns to make room for pigs that are coming behind them. And so that's probably put producers in a little worse bargaining shape over the last few weeks. Trouble is that's not going to get much better here in the short term. So we think this sell-off is overdone in both the cash and the futures. If we look at the futures, we got profits for this year down on our model down to about $12. That was as high as 30 in October. It was 21 about a month ago, and so not nearly as rosy a deal as what we saw just a few weeks back. Sow slaughter was down for the year as much as 8% in the summer. Notice that it caught up in the fourth quarter after we kind of started getting out of this PEDV thing. I think we were trying to balance the ages of some sow herds. We got sow herds old, and so we started selling some old sow late in the year when maybe we had some gilts available to replace them. The gilt slaughter data has been all over the map, and I really can't reconcile them with 3.7% growth. I really can't. And so I'm going to leave it at that. I think the USDA numbers make sense because of some anecdotal evidence that I'd picked up going into that. Here's our forecast for slaughter, and you can see robust growth the second half of the year. We think we're going to be up about 1% the first quarter, 4.5%, 7.5%, 6.5% in the second half of the year. Again, part of that increase from Q3 through Q4 will be offset by weights 1 to 2% lower. So for the year, 5% up on slaughter, about 4 to 4.1% on production. If you see the numbers here, 112.39, very similar to the kind of numbers we had in 2013. Of course, way larger than last year. And you know, there's some differences here. Obviously, Missouri and Iowa State both think that we're going to have the kind of growth that I'm thinking, or pretty close to it. Livestock Marketing Information Center is a little different from that. I think the guys, Jim Robb and his staff, tend to just take the straight USDA data and not play with it very much. And so for the rest of us, we're probably making some adjustments on that. December Hogs and Pigs report, price forecast at the time of the report. And we had hogs up in the low 90s in the summer, mid 90s in the second quarter, high 70s in the fourth quarter. Here's where the futures was on the 17th. They're probably $3 or $4 lower than that now. I think they're oversold. I think cash hogs are going to be better than that once we get out there. We're going to have to scramble. We've only got 3 weeks in at the prices we're selling, but we may have to scramble to get up into the 80s for an average for this quarter. I'm not ready to throw in the towel on my price forecast yet, given the other kind of extenuating circumstances that have been there for some time. So risks. Always the number one risk to a forecast in the hog business is a major export disruption. We're going to export about 22% of our product in 2014. If that stopped tomorrow, it'd cause a lot of trouble. And so that's the big one. The probability is low. The impact is huge. PEDV impact on pre-weaning mortality falls to near zero. We have it at about as 1/3 of the large. We talked about that a while ago. The more data I see, the more I think that we're getting closer to this one. So I think we're trending up on this survivability factor, and so that would have some positive impact on our forecast for supplies. Demand weakening, big risk because it's been a big driver the last couple of years. The good news is that consumer tastes and preferences don't change very fast in most cases. Now, just one bad press article could change that to some degree. But this one has some feet, I think. I think it has some legs, and I think we're going to see some help there. Exports, of course, the world economy is going to be important. And I would also I should probably also put on there what happens with the dollar. I mean, I'm not sure that we're going to try to reduce the value of the dollar much, but that could have some impact on exports for sure. How much expansion in pigs and chicken? As I pointed out, we think chicken is going to be about 4%. We think hog production is going to be a little larger than that, with pork production up about 4% as well. And then finally, packing capacity. If you go back, and I should have pointed out when I was there, the weekly numbers for our forecast for 2015 really aren't bad relative to capacity. That capacity number is pretty fuzzy, and we can go above it, and we got 2 or 3 weeks above it. We can go above it for a short period of time without a lot of trouble. The problem is if we continue this kind of growth, or even a partial of it, let's say we just go back to 2% for next year, and we go back to normal kind of litter rates, okay, well, the problem is going to be fall of 16. Now, I always point out that I've been saying that for, 3 years now, Jared? Something like that? I thought we were going to have a problem in the fall of 13 and the drought of 2012 saved us. I thought we were going to have a problem in the fall of 14 and PEDV saved us. I'm saying 15, I think we're going to be okay, but 16 looks like a wreck to me. And if we get very much growth at all, because we're going to have a tight capacity situation. The plant in Michigan will not be of help. It's not going to be up and running until 17, and so it won't be here fast enough to alleviate any problems we create in the fall of 16. And finally, the USDA is redoing the dietary guidelines, and they've kind of got a thing for processed meats. That is going to fall particularly hard on pork. It's not going to be very good for chicken because most of it is processed and pumped and all kinds of stuff that's sold through these government programs. Now, I always point out that it doesn't mean that any of us in this room are ever going to pay any attention to the USDA's dietary guidelines. I haven't read them lately. Have you? Show of hands. Yeah. But this provides the guidance for their buying programs. for school lunches, for the military, for lots of feeding programs. And so it does have an impact on our business, even if we don't ever read it.